The Middle East is one of the most important regions for American foreign policymakers. It is no secret as to why this is the case. Oil. The Middle East has the largest deposits of oil on the planet. The US has shown itself greedily willing to involve itself in the area if it can benefit or protect itself from harmful developments relating to the black gold liquid. The Gulf War is perhaps the best example of this. In 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded its small but oil-rich neighbor Kuwait, thereby becoming the benefactor of 1/5 of the world's oil supply. A belligerent and unstable dictator in such an advantageous position sent policymakers in Washington D.C. into a panic, especially since the oil fields of Saudi Arabia could have been the next target for Saddam. What followed was the manifestation of America becoming the sole superpower in the world, as it organized a coalition that overwhelmed the Iraqi dictator with the devastating efficiency of modern weaponry. In the same year that Saddam Hussein formally ascended to the presidency, neighboring Iran was going through a historic change of its own. The long-reigning Shah had been toppled, and the Islamists were tightening their grip on power. Saddam feared that their enigmatic leader Ayatollah Khomeini would export his brand of Shia revolutionary fervor to the streets of Baghdad and Najaf. Iraq did, after all, have a majority Shia population, who just so happened to be marginalized from the halls of power by Saddam and his predecessors. They would be ripe for exploitation by Khomeini for his own political designs. At the same time, Saddam saw an opportunity. The revolutionary change in Iran had created a vacuum of chaos which he could exploit. So in September 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. What ensued was a bitter 8-year-long conflict that saw the use of poison gas, human wave attacks, and World War I-style trench warfare. In the end, neither side won as a military stalemate dictated a negotiated ceasefire in 1988. The losses were monumental in money and manpower for both countries. By 1990, Iraq's financial difficulties in the wake of the Iran-Iraq War had not improved. Cost estimates for rebuilding the country's infrastructure hovered at over $200 billion, a staggering amount that Iraq's annual oil revenues of $13 billion could never hope to alleviate. As foreign debts to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait loomed, the Iraqi people were getting impatient with their leaders' broken promises and empty propaganda. New plots against the dictator's life were being uncovered at an alarming rate. Saddam's only hope of slipping the economic noose was to convince the Gulf sheikhs to forgive the debt. In his view, Iraq had acted as their shield against the Ayatollah's revolution. While Iraqis suffered and died, the sheikhs lounged in relative safety. After 8 years of crippling war, letting him off the hook was the least they could do. But they were unmoved by Saddam's pleas. The Gulf states refused to forgive the debt. Being spurned by the sheikhs flared Saddam's violent temper, and his anger quickly settled on one country in particular, Kuwait. The small Gulf country was no stranger to Iraqi claims over its territory. Towards the end of the 19th century, influence over Kuwait was contested by the Ottomans and the British. The latter won out, controlling the foreign policy for the ruling Sabah family. Prior to this, Kuwait had fallen under the nominal authority of the Ottoman Vilayat of Basra in modern-day southern Iraq. As Iraq itself became a state in the aftermath of World War I and the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire, it tried to assert its irredentist claims over its small neighbor numerous times, especially after oil was discovered in the 1930s. As recently as 1961, a few weeks after its full independence from Britain, Kuwait was threatened with invasion by the then Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Karim Qasim. The anticipated invasion was only averted after the British sent their own forces in. But this did not put an end to Iraqi irredentism. For many in the country, Iraq contained 18 provinces, Kuwait was the long-absent 19th. So in the early months of 1990, when the Kuwaiti Emir refused to forgive Iraq's debts, it was like salt in the wound. Adding to the consternation was the fact that Kuwait had been exceeding oil production limits set by OPEC, which drove the price per barrel down considerably. For a country like Iraq, whose economy was entirely dependent on oil revenues, the price drop made economic recovery almost impossible. Saddam threatened the Kuwaitis, saying that they were conducting economic warfare against him. The Kuwaitis responded obstinately, saying they would not cave to extortion. Tensions continued to escalate when Saddam deployed 30,000 troops to the Kuwaiti border on July 21st. It was an alarming show of force, but most in the international community assumed the dictator was bluffing in an attempt to bully the Kuwaitis into acquiescence. Saddam, however, was not bluffing. On August 2nd, 1990, the Iraqi army invaded Kuwait. Eight years of war against Iran had hardened the Iraqi military into a formidable force. With over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and a wide array of artillery and aircraft at his disposal, Saddam Hussein commanded the fourth largest army in the world. Kuwait never stood a chance. In less than 24 hours, the Kuwaiti army, a token force of 14,000 men, had completely collapsed. The Kuwaiti Emir and his family fled for their lives to neighboring Saudi Arabia in a convoy of Mercedes-Benz limousines. In one swift stroke, Saddam had returned a branch to the root, annexing the 19th province and gaining direct control of over 20% of the world's oil supplies. From his palace in Baghdad, the dictator was jubilant, but his invasion of Kuwait would not go unanswered. The international community was outraged. Within a matter of hours, the United Nations had passed a resolution calling for the unconditional withdrawal of Saddam's army from Kuwait. An embargo against Iraqi oil was implemented, economic sanctions were imposed, and Kuwait's financial assets were frozen to deny Iraq their use. It was an extreme reaction, one Saddam thought he had guarded himself against. A week before the invasion, he'd met with the US ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, to gauge what America's response would be to a potential attack on Kuwait. Glaspie had told Saddam that the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts, which he interpreted as a subtle nudge that an invasion would not result in any serious response. When he left the meeting with Glaspie, Saddam believed that he had received the green light. After all, Iraq had enjoyed the patronage and partnership of the Americans for years. Surely they would not rally in defense of a tiny, insignificant nation like Kuwait. He was wrong. George H.W. Bush, the President of the United States, vowed to evict the Iraqi army from Kuwait, one way or another. In invading Kuwait, Saddam had crossed a line with the Americans. They were willing to arm him, pay him, and use him as a regional pawn, but they were not willing to tolerate a new status quo where he controlled 1/5 of the world's oil supplies. Bush quickly dispatched his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, to broker a deal with the Saudis to allow the deployment of United States troops to the kingdom. Fearing that the Iraqi army might cross the border in an attempt to capture Saudi oil fields as well, King Fahd agreed to open his airports to US troops. Within a matter of days, American soldiers were walking off planes in Riyadh, the first stage of a massive defense mobilization that came to be known as Operation Desert Shield. Back in Washington D.C., the crisis in Kuwait had taken on a distinctly moral dimension for President George H.W. Bush. He came to believe that Iraq's annexation of Kuwait was akin to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor or Germany's invasion of Poland, a treacherous breach of international law by a bloodthirsty dictator. Bush was soon directly comparing Saddam to the German leader in World War II, believing that appeasing such a tyrant would set a frightening precedent and embolden other autocrats around the world. To oppose Saddam, Bush began assembling a massive international coalition. stalwart allies like the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan joined eagerly, and after some strategically deployed bribes, Arab nations like Egypt and Syria joined the club. Even the Soviet Union and China agreed to stand aside, refusing to support Saddam in his quixotic misadventure. In the end, around 40 nations signed on to Bush's coalition. Saddam Hussein quickly realized the gravity of his miscalculation. He had made an enemy of the world's last remaining superpower, joined by virtually the entire international community. In essence, it was Iraq against the world. Saddam, however, was defiant. To gain leverage over the coalition, he kept thousands of foreign workers in Kuwait as hostages, using them as human shields to deter any potential attack. It was a cruel, impulsive stunt, and all it succeeded in doing was deepening the world's contempt for him. In December of 1990, all of the hostages had been returned home. By the end of the year, it was clear that nothing short of direct military action would pry Kuwait out of Saddam's grip. The United Nations passed Resolution 678, which authorized the use of all necessary means to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. The resolution gave Saddam Hussein a final deadline of January 15, 1991 to pull his troops out. If he refused, the coalition would attack. The deadline came and went, and on January 17, 1991, the coalition launched a massive assault on Iraq and occupied Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm, as it came to be known, began with a blistering air offensive on Baghdad itself. Hundreds of planes dropped thousands of bombs onto the capital, and as the city went dim, block by block, Iraqi citizens braced themselves for the days ahead. For 6 weeks, the coalition's air forces rained death on Saddam's army and Iraq's cities. Using cutting-edge hardware like smart bombs and laser-guided missiles, American planes pummeled the country night after night. In the Western media, the accuracy of these weapons was lavishly overhyped, portrayed as surgical and bloodless, but the cold truth was that they often resulted in civilian casualties. It seemed as if Saddam's main offensive strategy was to target the oil fields of Kuwait. Iraqi soldiers set over 600 oil wells and lakes on fire as they retreated from the advance of the US-led forces. But this scorched earth policy was not very effective in slowing the coalition forces down. Meanwhile, American jets devastated Iraq's infrastructure. Water treatment plants, electrical grids, sewage systems, bridges, and other vital public works were left in ruins, imposing immense physical hardships on the Iraqi civilian population. On February 24th, satisfied that Iraq had been sufficiently weakened by the air campaign, the coalition moved its ground forces into Iraq and Kuwait. The Iraqi army, deflated and demoralized by weeks of air raids and bombing runs, simply melted away. Tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrendered to the advancing coalition forces, dispelling American fears of high casualties and Vietnam-style attrition. The rout reached its bloody apex at a 6-lane highway north of Kuwait City. Hundreds of Iraqi soldiers, fleeing north in stolen civilian vehicles and military transports, were trapped in a bottleneck by coalition jets and massacred. The Highway of Death, as it came to be known, was seen as an excessive case of butchery by the world's press, and under pressure from within and without, the Bush administration made the decision to end the ground war exactly 100 hours after it had begun. On March 3, 1991, a ceasefire was declared. All told, the Gulf War was a colossal defeat for Saddam, forever marring his image on the world stage. But it was not the end, and he was more determined than ever to survive what happened next. Emboldened by Saddam's resounding defeat in Kuwait, Kurdish and Shia elements of Iraq rose up in revolt against the dictator. Ultimately, the 1991 uprisings failed, and Saddam Hussein had proven that on his home turf, no challenger could overcome his will to remain in power. Thank you guys for watching. I want to give a big shout out to Zach from Conflicted, a history podcast which goes into detail about interesting episodes of the past, such as the partition of India and the Afghan-Soviet War. He's helping me write a biography on Saddam Hussein, so be on the lookout for that very soon. As usual, thank you to my patrons for your continued support. Until next time, peace!